Okay, here we are. We made it to the last week. You guys hung in there, week 5, and you're almost home free, so to speak. We're going to look at the final unit of study that we have set out for you in this course, which is ethics. Now, you've had just a little bit of that in your worldview reading, whether you know it or not. There's a little bit of this idea of ethics fused in to some of your reading there. But we also wanted to, or I wanted to, introduce you a little bit more deliberately to the discipline. I'm going to give you 2 lectures on ethics. And so we've covered a lot of material: hermeneutics, worldview, theology, and now ethics, which you guys have done very well. And so here we go. Let me give you the first of these. Lay the groundwork a little bit for you, sort of look at what ethics is, where it fits into sort of the dialogue that we have throughout history. Where does it fit in, and so on and so forth. Well, ethics is essentially a philosophical discipline. And so when we study ethics, we're doing philosophy, really. And by the way, philosophy is defined. This is Craig Mitchell's definition. It's the investigation of the nature, causes, or principles of reality, knowledge, and or values, based on logical reasoning rather than empirical methods. Okay, and so that's the definition we're looking at for philosophy. It's a study of things that cannot be put in a test tube, in other words. You know, not everything can be examined in that way, but that doesn't mean that the knowledge isn't there to be discovered. It's just a different way of discovering information and knowledge, philosophy. When people think of ethical studies, sometimes they think that that's just by definition sort of a religious topic, but that's not true. Ethics concerns all people, whether you're religious or not. Now, of course, as Christians, we have a very particular approach to ethics, and certainly we want to acknowledge that, especially here in this course, which is a course on biblical foundations. Well, let me just kind of try to help you place ethics into the topic or the discipline of philosophy. How does it fit in to philosophy? I said it was a philosophical discipline. So where does it fit in to this discipline called philosophy? Well, let me just point it out to you. By the way, let me just give you right off the bat, ethics is the study of the good and the right, the nature of the good and the right. So that's how we would define ethics. And so that fits into philosophy in the following way. There's 4 categories, or branches, if you like, of philosophical study. The first branch is called logic. That is the first branch. Logic is the science of arguments. It is the study of the foundations of reasoning. Okay, and there's 2 types of logic. You have inductive logic, which is based on probability, and you have deductive logic, built around premises and conclusions. Okay, so logic, your first branch. Second branch, metaphysics. Metaphysics. That's the branch of philosophy that concerns itself with the nature of reality. The study of reality, that's what metaphysics is. Sort of proceeding on some assumptions about reality, just looking at reality, trying to understand it. And by the way, just a bit of trivia for you, theology is a subcategory of metaphysics. And so whenever we were sort of doing our theology section, we were engaging metaphysics. You may not have known that, but now you do. Okay, epistemology, what is that? Epistemology is the study of knowledge, or the nature of knowledge. And so, whereas metaphysics is the study of reality, epistemology asks the how do we know question. You know, how do we gain, how do we know knowledge? How do we gain knowledge? How do we, what is the nature of knowledge? It asks these kinds of questions. And so you can see the difference there between metaphysics and epistemology. And then finally, we have axiology. Axiology is the branch of philosophy that deals with value judgments, and this is where ethics fits in. There's 2 areas under axiology. One is aesthetics, which is the study of beauty, the value of beauty and art, and so on. But then ethics is the other that other category, or that subcategory under axiology, and this is, of course, the study of the good, the nature of the good and the right. And so ethics is a kind of axiology, and it's part of that 4th branch of philosophy. So you see where ethics fits into this discussion, how it fits into the category, the discipline of philosophy. Well, let me also kind of help you to understand a little bit about ethics and its place in history. You know, because we haven't just uniformly thought about these things throughout history in one way. There's been a variety of of views about how to handle ethics and philosophy generally, and the different methods and what branch of philosophy is emphasized, and so on and so forth, and different theories about these sorts of things. And this is just tended to shift, and there's a trajectory through history that we can sort of notice and take note of. And so let me just help you do that. Obviously, in the short amount of time that we have to paint with very broad strokes. And so you'll have to forgive me for that. But hopefully this will just give you a broad outline of the way we've thought about these things throughout history. Well, let's look at pre-modernity, that pre-modern era. Okay, this is going to be recorded history till about 1600. Okay, and so what are some characteristics about the way we handled philosophy, and then also, more importantly, ethics? Obviously, broad strokes here, but metaphysics is the first philosophy in this era. So in the pre-modern era, people generally began with metaphysics. They began with reality. Okay, what is real? That's where they start, and they acknowledge reality and study it and try to understand it, and that's where they begin. Okay, there was a community or a corporate identity that's characteristic of the pre-modern era. People thought of themselves less as individuals and more as a corporate identity. And so that was a very significant feature of this era. The community then, this corporate identity, would attest to the truth. So they're beginning with metaphysics, okay, the nature of reality. And so they acknowledge and attest to the reality of truth, okay? And so that's a feature that you'll want to take note of. Now, ethically speaking, for the pre-moderns generally, ethics were, or I should say, people were what you might call moral realists. Okay, moral realists. That is to say that values are real and objective. Values are real and objective. So this is a conviction of people generally in the pre-modern era. All right, so what's that second sort of big sweep through history as we're sort of trying to take note of the trajectory of the way people have handled ethics and philosophy generally in history? The modern era. The modern era is from about 1600 to roughly 1950 is sort of where we draw the line there. Obviously, there's a little bleed on both sides of that, but just to give you a framework. The modern era. Epistemology, by the way, is the first philosophy in the modern era. No longer do we, generally speaking, no longer do we ask or sort of seek to understand reality first, but rather first we ask the question, how do we obtain knowledge? What is knowledge? How do we get it? Where does it come from? This is the first philosophy in the modern era. And you can see the difference there, and there's some implications if you think about them. Knowledge comes through reason for the continental rationalists, okay? And then knowledge comes through the senses for the British empiricists. These are two major groups that you find in the modern era. And so they start with epistemology. And so the continental rationalists would answer the question, where does knowledge come from? Reason. And then the British empiricists would answer the question, where does knowledge come from? They would say through the senses. Okay. Now, ethics are largely characterized by, in the modern era, by moral irrealism. You recall in the pre-modern era, they were moral realists, but now we have moral irrealism as a dominant feature. This is to say that values are man-made and subjective. It's a pretty big difference than what we had in the pre-modern era, right? Values and ethics are man-made and they're subjective. Now, don't misunderstand. Generally, they were considered to still be necessary. Okay, we still need these things in order to have a civilized community to live in. We need them, but nonetheless, subjective and man-made. Okay, so let's move forward finally to the postmodern era. This is the era in which we live now. So generally 1950 to present is considered the postmodern era. Again, epistemology is your first philosophy. This is where you begin. It's your first philosophy. However, science and reason are no longer the sources of knowledge. Okay, this is a major shift. Science and reason are no longer the sources of knowledge. Rather, the community determines knowledge. Okay, this is a major feature for the pre-modern era. Of course, this doesn't describe every person to a T. These are just sort of broad strokes, very common features of the time in which we live. Okay, so please take note of that. The community establishes the truth rather than attests to the truth. Do you remember in the pre-modern era? Because, by the way, the postmodern era is a return to this more of a community identity, which is kind of like the pre-modern era. But here's one major difference: is in the pre-modern era, the community attested to the truth. They said, "There it is." In the postmodern era, the community creates the truth. They establish the truth, and you can see the difference there. There's a difference. Ethics and beauty are likewise established by the community. So ethics in the postmodern era are established by the community. There's no objective ethic or morality. There's no sort of objective moral truth out there. That these are things that are created and established by the community. And so anyway, maybe that helps you to sort of look at the trajectory of history and kind of see where it fits in that way. And you can kind of see where we are now and sort of see where we fit into the picture even now. Perhaps some of these features seem familiar to you, and you can say, well, that makes sense. I've read this article, or I see these sorts of things, and hear people say certain things, and this starts to make sense to me a little bit. Hopefully it will do that for you. Let's look at the Roman numeral number 2 on your notes. And let's ask the question, what is the definition of rightness? If we're going to study ethics, then we're dealing with what's right. And so how do you define that? How do you define what is right? Well, if ethics is the study of the nature of the right and the good, then how do we know what it is? Well, let me just give you a few theories. Obviously, there's not just one answer to this question, but people have offered a number of answers. And then we'll end our discussion, our lecture on this particular topic, with what has Christianity usually, how have they handled this question of defining what is right? So we'll sort of conclude with answering that. How has Christianity handled this question of what is right? Well, anyway, let's start with some other theories leading up to the Christian view. All right, well, here's one. Might is right. You could call it that. You could say might is right. How do you define what is right? Power. Okay, the theory that establishes power, physical, political, etc., as being the standard or the definition, what determines rightness. Now, honestly, this is not that widely held, because I think people generally are able to see and distinguish a difference between power and moral rightness. You just have to dream up some of the famous tyrants from history, Hitler, Stalin, etc., and it becomes pretty clear that power does not equal moral rightness. But anyway, nonetheless, it is a theory and has been held by certain folks throughout history. What's another way to a theory that might help us define what is right? I don't think actually these things will help you define them if you have a Christian ethic, but this is the way that some people have handled it nonetheless. Community-based morals. This is going to sound very familiar based on what we just spoke about with postmodernity. Community-based morals. This is the view that one's own community, culture, etc., determines rightness. Moral commands are really just cultural demands, as one writer has stated it. It suggests a moral relativity. Any common feature from one community or culture to the next as it regards morals or ethics is just accidental. Okay? And this is a common view in the postmodern era, as you might imagine. But it does leave us without a warrant to condemn obvious evils. Now, we do condemn obvious evils. When we talk about Hitler, everybody that I know is quite comfortable condemning what Hitler did, even if they're not a Christian. But what I'm suggesting is that if you're operating on a community-based moral paradigm, you don't have a very good objective reason for condemning evil. You do it, but you don't have a good reason for doing it, is what I'm suggesting. Okay, well, what's another theory of how to define rightness? Moderation. This theory of moderation. This is the balance between two extremes. And that balance between those two extremes is where virtue is to be found, or rightness, if you like. Now, this accords with um, historically with Aristotle. Aristotle had something that he called the doctrine of the mean, and Aristotle believed that rightness or virtue was to be found in moderation. So, if bravery is a virtue, then a deficiency of bravery is a vice, and an excess of a virtue is a vice. So, what's a deficiency of bravery? Well, cowardice, right? That's a vice. And so you swing back to the center and you have virtue again with bravery. What's an excess? Well, you think, well, how could you have an excess of bravery? Can you be too brave? Well, think of it like this. If I get up on the top of the Empire State Building and do a swan dive off, would you think me to be brave? Of course not. You'd think I was a fool, and of course I would be. Foolhardiness is not a virtue, that's a vice. And so you kind of see what Aristotle means there. And so virtue is to be found in moderation. And so that's how this theory works. Um, it's sort of the balance between two extremes. Okay. The only problem is that we still need a way to determine what the balance is, and so this theory kind of leaves us a little bit short in that way. But anyway, there's another theory. It's called there is no right. And that's hardly a theory at all, isn't it? But anyway, some people would hold to this. It's the view that denies the existence of morality whatsoever. A.J. Ayer claims that ought statements are really just emotive statements. Right? That when we speak in terms of moral absolutes, really, we're just speaking about the various different ways that we feel and things that we want and like. In other words, morality corresponds to your taste. So you might say that murder, when you say things like murder is morally wrong, you're really just saying, I do not like murder. Murder does not affect my community in a productive way. And so this is one way that you can handle what or how to define rightness. Hedonism is another theory. Hedonism, it comes from the 4th century Epicureans, and it states that what brings the most pleasure and the least amount of pain is what is right. What brings about the most pleasure and the least amount of pain is how you define what is right. So you can probably think of some problems associated with this. I can think of several, but let me just give you one. First of all, not every pleasure is good. You can probably think of a number of examples of that. Here's one. A sadistic pleasure that comes from torturing people. If that's pleasurable to someone, and surely it is to certain persons, I don't think anybody's going to say, well, good, that helps us to define what rightness is. Obviously not. And so pleasure is not always a good indicator of what rightness is. And something else too, pain is not always a good indication of what rightness is not. In other words, you can probably think of certain kinds of pain that it actually is good, such as, how about hard work? You get out there and you work very hard. This is actually not a bad thing. This is a good thing, though it brings pain, but yet it is still good. Or how about study? Just really immersing yourself in study. This sort of brings about a certain kind of pain. It's hard, but nevertheless, it's a good thing. Generally, people consider this to be a good thing. And so you can see how perhaps hedonism falls short in a number of ways for determining or defining what rightness is. What's another theory? How about utilitarianism? One figure that's associated with this is John Stuart Mill from the 19th century. He argued that what right is what brings the greatest good to the greatest number of persons in the long run. Okay? What rightness is what brings the greatest amount of good to the greatest number of persons in the long run. And just to clarify, Stuart meant this in a qualitative sense. Okay, so don't misunderstand him. In other words, an unhappy man is better than a happy pig. So we want to make sure that we understand him right and don't misunderstand him. But nevertheless, we need to ask, how do you judge the results of actions? Okay, how do you judge that? If these results are good, then how is that conclusion determined? So something happens, you determine this is good because it impacts the most number of people in a positive way. But how do you determine whether those actions were actually good and the outcomes were actually good? We still are left without a good standard for determining that. And so utilitarianism sometimes doesn't help us in that way. Well, let's think about a theory and a number of features related to that as it regards the Christian view here. All right, so let's address this in a few ways. First, what's the origin of rightness according to the Christian view? Well, right is grounded in a God. Rightness, moral goodness is grounded in a God who's both loving and just. This God is immutable and omnibenevolent, right? That means God is all good. And so this is where rightness comes from. It's grounded in this God who's all good, okay? And he never changes. This is the grounding for rightness according to the Christian, okay? So revelation of rightness. How do we sort of understand rightness? Where does it come from? How do we understand it? How does it come to our consciousness? God has revealed what is right in two ways. We've already talked about this, so this is just a quick review. General revelation, you recall that discussion, and special revelation. This is where our sense of rightness comes from. This is how it comes to us from God through these two modes of revelation. General revelation, as you recall, is available to all persons at all times, God revealing himself and thus revealing what is right. Mankind has a universal sense of right and wrong. We've talked about this. C.S. Lewis expounded on this. Now, special revelation is found in the divinely inspired Word of God. It is the same revelation of God's moral character that is found written upon the hearts of humankind as well. So it corresponds to that. Since it is more explicit, though, special revelation, from what is just written on our hearts, since it's more explicit, it provides an objective benchmark for determining rightness. And so we get what is right. It comes to us through God's revelation. Okay? So that's a second feature of how Christians handle this idea of how do we determine what is right. There's also a feature of absoluteness associated with the Christian view. Christian ethics is inconsistent with postmodernity, I would argue, in that it understands morality to be, Christianity does, morality to be objective and absolute in nature. So that's a major feature of the Christian view. In other words, rightness is grounded in a perfect and unchanging God who wills mankind to be perfectly conformed to his own perfect nature. That's how it's grounded. It's absolute. It's not subjective or created by man, but it's objective and real. And so that's another feature. It's absoluteness. How is rightness discovered? Let's think about that in another sense, according to the Christian worldview. For the Christian, ethics are not created by man, but they're discovered. That's an important feature. We discover these things. We don't create them. God reveals rightness, as we talked about when we just spoke about Revelation. But we as finite creatures are unable to fully determine right from wrong. We don't really have the ability to do that as finite creatures, at least not without error. So it's God, the omniscient, immutable, benevolent creator, that determines and reveals rightness. In this way, the Christian ethic has a superior justification to its competing views, I would argue. Namely, it has a proper rationale. A non-Christian may believe in Christian ethical principles, and often do, but he or she does so without a proper and objective foundation for that belief. And so anyway, hopefully this gives you an idea of how ethics fits into the historical dialogue, how it fits into philosophy as a discipline, what the different theories are of how to define rightness, and then what are some Christian features for answering that question. I hope it's been helpful. Got one more lecture coming your way as it regards ethics. I think you'll find it to be interesting, and we'll see you then.